"Sir, can you take me home before my mom forgets me?" The words were so small they should have disappeared beneath the rain, beneath the clicking cameras, beneath the polished laughter spilling out from the ballroom doors, but somehow they didn't. They cut through everything. Ethan Whitmore had one hand on the door of his black Rolls-Royce, one foot already angled toward the warmth of the leather seat, when he stopped. Really stopped. For a second, the whole sidewalk seemed to hold its breath with him. The gala behind him still glittered through the glass walls of the hotel, all gold light and crystal chandeliers, and people who smiled too quickly with champagne still caught between their fingers. A string quartet floated faintly from somewhere inside, softened by the thick doors and the steady hiss of October rain. Then Ethan looked down. The girl standing beside him couldn't have been older than 9, maybe 10 at most. She was black, thin as a question mark in an oversized brown coat that looked like it had once belonged to someone much taller, the sleeves swallowing most of her hands. Rain darkened the edges of the fabric and beaded along her little braids. A faded backpack hung from one shoulder, so full it pulled her slightly to one side. Her sneakers were soaked through, white once maybe, now gray with city water and old sidewalk dust. She didn't look up at him the way most people did. Not with awe, not with fear, not even with desperation. She looked up like she had run out of every other option and had chosen honesty because it was the only thing she had left. "Excuse me, sir," she said again, her voice careful, almost formal, like someone had taught her manners, and she was trying hard not to lose them in the cold. "Can you take me home?" One of Ethan's security men moved first, instinct sharp as ever. "Hey, sweetheart, step back," he said, not unkindly, but in that practiced tone people used when they wanted trouble to disappear without making a scene. The little girl did step back, just half a foot, but she didn't run. She held the strap of her backpack tighter. Ethan felt the heat of the cameras still pointed in his direction. He knew what the photos would show tomorrow if he handled this wrong. Billionaire cornered by child outside fundraiser. Another spectacle for people who consumed pain as entertainment as long as it came with captions and clean lighting. A blonde woman from the event committee paused near the revolving door, lips tightening as she glanced over. Security should call someone. She murmured to no one in particular, though loud enough to be heard. You never know what stories kids make up these days. Ethan almost nodded. That would have been the normal thing. Efficient. Safe. One call, one handoff, one less complication before midnight. But then the girl said, very softly, "I know my address. I just don't want to walk there alone in the dark." And that changed it. Not because the words were dramatic. They weren't. They were too plain for that. Too real. Ethan studied her face more carefully now. There were no tears on it. Just rain. Her cheeks were cold flushed, her mouth small and still, her eyes too steady for someone her age. It struck him then, not for the first time in his life, but perhaps the first time in years, how exhausting it must be for a child to sound this composed. "What's your name?" he asked. The security man glanced at him, surprised by the question. The girl blinked once, as if she hadn't expected to get this far. "Naomi," she said. "Naomi Carter." "And where is your mother, Naomi?" At that, something changed in her face. Not fear exactly. Something quieter. Something worn down. "She was supposed to meet me after work," Naomi said. "She always does. But she didn't come, and it's getting late, and my phone died, and I waited where she told me to wait." She swallowed. "I think something happened." Behind Ethan, another car pulled up under the hotel awning, tires whispering through puddles. A valet jogged forward with an umbrella. The city kept moving the way cities do when someone's life is quietly falling apart right in front of them. Ethan looked at Naomi's backpack, at the way her fingers had gone pink from the cold, at the politeness she was still forcing through whatever fear sat in her chest. And for one strange, uncomfortable second, all the money in his world felt useless compared to the simple fact that a little girl was asking not for cash, not for food, not for rescue in some grand cinematic sense, but for a ride home. "Open the door," he said. His security man hesitated. "Sir." Ethan's eyes never left Naomi. "Open the door," he repeated, calmer this time. The rear passenger door clicked open beneath the hotel lights, and Naomi stood frozen, staring at the inside of the car as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to believe him. "Come on," Ethan said. "You can show me the way." Naomi climbed in carefully, trying not to drip on the seat, trying somehow to make herself smaller in a car built to make powerful men feel larger. Ethan slid in after her, the scent of rain and wool and faint hotel perfume still clinging to his jacket. As the door shut and the city dimmed behind tinted glass, Naomi whispered an address in a part of town Ethan had not visited in years, and the driver pulled away from the curb. Outside, Manhattan blurred into streaks of red brake lights and wet pavement. Inside the car, the silence thickened. Ethan adjusted his cuff, then stopped when he noticed Naomi staring at her own hands. Tiny hands. Cold hands. The kind a child should not have to keep folded so tightly in her lap. He had no idea yet that before the night was over, that little voice would lead him to a dark apartment, a note taped to a locked door, and the first crack in his own carefully sealed heart. The city slid past in long, wet ribbons of light, red and white and amber smeared across the rain-streaked windows like paint dragged by a tired hand. And for several blocks the only sound inside the car was the low hum of the engine and the soft hiss of the heater pushing warmth toward a child who still looked cold all the way through. Naomi sat with her backpack on her lap, both arms wrapped around it as if it held something fragile, or maybe as if it was the only thing in the world she could count on staying where she left it. Her sneakers hovered just above the floor mat, too small to rest flat, and every time the car slowed, the laces trembled slightly with the motion. Ethan noticed that before he noticed anything else about her. Then he noticed everything. The careful way she kept her wet coat tucked in so it would not touch the door panel. The way she glanced at the ceiling light once and then away, as if even looking too long might count as taking too much. The way children do when they have learned early that gratitude must come before comfort. "You can lean back," Ethan said at last, his voice lower now, less public, stripped of the tone people used in boardrooms and interviews. "You do not need to sit so stiff." Naomi nodded quickly, but she did not lean back. "I am okay," she said. "Thank you, sir." "Sir." Again. The word sat oddly in the air between them, respectful and distant all at once. Ethan loosened the knot of his tie a fraction. Across from him, reflected faintly in the glass, he could see his own face in brief flashes whenever the streetlights hit just right. Gray at the temples. Controlled. Tired in a way expensive sleep could not fix. He had spent years mastering the art of moving through rooms without really entering them, speaking without saying much, helping through signatures and donations and polished statements, while keeping the mess of actual human need an arm's length away. But this was different. There was nothing polished about a 9-year-old girl in soaked sneakers trying not to leave water on his floor mats. "How long were you waiting?" he asked. Naomi looked down at her hands before answering. "Since a little after 5. Ethan glanced toward the dashboard clock. It was nearly 10:30. Something tightened in his chest. "Outside. At first in the food court across the street from my mom's building," she said. "Then they closed. Then outside under the awning. Then I walked back to the hotel because there were more lights there." She said it plainly, like she was listing steps in a school assignment, but the picture landed with far more force than if she had cried telling it. Ethan looked toward the front. His driver kept his eyes on the road. His security man, seated beside him, remained still, professional, but Ethan caught the slight shift in the rearview mirror. Even he was listening now. "You did the right thing coming where there were people," Ethan said. Naomi gave a tiny nod, then added, "Most people did not look at me." That one he felt. Not because it was surprising. Because it was not. Rain tapped softly against the roof. The car turned downtown. Then farther east, away from polished storefronts and bright lobbies and into narrower streets where the sidewalks looked rougher and the puddles deeper. Naomi began giving directions in a small clear voice. "Go straight at the next light." Then left at the pharmacy with the blue sign. Then 2 more blocks. She knew every turn without hesitation. Ethan wondered how many nights she had memorized this route from the passenger seat of someone else's tired car, or from the bus, or on foot beside a mother too exhausted to talk. "Your mother's name?" he asked. "Renee Carter." "And where does she work?" Naomi shrugged a little. "Cleaning mostly. Offices. Sometimes stores. Sometimes wherever they call her. She says work is work if the rent gets paid." There was no self-pity in her voice. Just repetition. Something often heard, often stored. Ethan looked at the backpack again. "What do you have in there?" Naomi's fingers tightened around the straps, then eased. "My school stuff. Crayons. A snack I saved. My extra socks." She paused. and my house key. But sometimes the lock sticks, so my mom has to push the door with her shoulder. Ethan stared at her for a moment. There was that quiet, unbearable dignity again. No complaint, just facts. The kind children gather when life has taught them to prepare for friction the way other children prepare for recess. At a red light, he reached beside him and pulled a cashmere throw from the built-in compartment near the armrest, one the car kept for clients and winter events. He held it out. Naomi looked at it, as if it might be a trick. Go ahead, he said. It is clean. She took it with both hands. Thank you. A second later, she did not drape it over herself. She folded it neatly over her knees instead, careful, almost formal, and that small gesture hit Ethan harder than he liked. Naomi, he said, and she looked up immediately, not startled, just attentive. When we get there, if your mother is not home, I need you to tell me the truth about everything. Do you understand? She nodded once. I will. Then, after a beat, she asked the question so softly he almost missed it. If she is not there, will you still stay until I know where she is? Ethan had handled negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars, without his pulse changing by a single beat. But that question, asked in that careful little voice under the hum of the heater and the smell of rain-damp wool, landed in him like something heavy dropped into deep water. He looked at Naomi, really looked, and saw not neediness, not drama, not even fear in the ordinary sense. He saw endurance running on fumes. Yes, he said, I will stay. Naomi let out the smallest breath, almost soundless, and turned her face toward the window. A minute later, the car slowed in front of a brick building with half its windows dark and one flickering hallway light buzzing above a narrow entrance. The block was quiet, too quiet, and the kind of cold that lived close to the river seemed to sit in the air. Naomi pressed one hand lightly to the glass. That is it, she whispered. Ethan looked up at the building, then at the darkened doorway, and something in the stillness of that place made his stomach sink before they had even stepped out. Naomi was out of the car before the driver could fully circle around with an umbrella, her small sneakers splashing into a shallow gutter of rainwater that reflected the apartment building in broken yellow light. Ethan stepped out a second later, the cold hitting him harder here than it had in front of the hotel, sharper somehow, less polished, the kind that slipped through wool and settled into bone. The building stood 6 stories tall, old brick gone dark with age and weather, its narrow windows staring down like tired eyes. One light buzzed over the entrance, flickering at uneven intervals, and the glass door had been repaired so many times the metal frame looked layered with years of quiet strain. Naomi was already at the front step, digging into her backpack with fingers that had started to shake again, whether from cold or nerves Ethan could not tell. She pulled out a small ring with 2 keys and chose one quickly. Sometimes it sticks, she said, almost apologetically, as if the door might embarrass her. She pushed the key in, turned it, and pressed her shoulder gently to the glass. Nothing. She tried again, a little harder this time. The lock clicked, but the door still would not open. Ethan stepped forward without thinking and placed one hand against the frame. The door gave with a rough scrape, and a wave of stale hallway air met them, warm in temperature but not in feeling, carrying the faint smells of old radiator heat, damp coats, and somebody's dinner from hours ago. Naomi looked up at him. Thank you, she said. Ethan nodded once. Stay close. The hallway was narrow and dim, painted in a beige that had long ago surrendered to gray, with mailboxes lining one wall and a staircase at the far end lit by another buzzing bulb. Naomi led the way toward the stairs, her backpack bouncing lightly against her coat with each step, and Ethan followed, suddenly aware of how loud his shoes sounded in a place like this. The security man stayed a pace behind, silent now, his presence no longer intrusive so much as solid. On the 3rd floor, Naomi stopped at apartment 3C. The door was painted a tired blue, chipped at the bottom, with a holiday wreath made from dollar store ribbon hanging slightly crooked even though the season had long passed. Naomi reached into her pocket, then froze. There was something taped at eye level, a piece of white paper curling slightly at the corners. Ethan saw her face change before he even read it. Not panic. Something sadder. Recognition. Naomi stepped closer and slowly peeled the tape from one edge. Her lips moved before any sound came out. Wait somewhere warm, baby. She did not cry. She just stood there with the note in both hands, staring at the handwriting like she was trying to pull the rest of her mother's voice out of it. Ethan looked at the door. He could see now that the apartment beyond was dark. No slice of light under the frame. No television sound. No movement. Naomi slid the key in with a care that felt ceremonial and opened the door. The place inside was still. One room opened into another with barely any separation, just a small kitchen to the left, a narrow table near the window, and a worn couch with a folded blanket draped across one arm. A lamp stood near the wall, unplugged. The refrigerator hummed softly. Everything else was quiet. Naomi reached for the switch and the overhead light came on late, after a weak flicker, revealing a home that was clean in the way only hard-working people's homes often are, not because it was easy to keep that way, but because order was one of the last forms of dignity no one could take without permission. On the table sat a cereal bowl turned upside down to dry, a school paper with a gold star in one corner, and a crayon drawing of a house with smoke rising from the chimney in thick blue loops. Ethan stepped farther in, then stopped. There was no sign of Renee. No purse on the chair. No shoes by the door except Naomi's smaller pair and one set of women's work sneakers left neatly on a rubber mat. Naomi moved through the apartment in silence, checking the little bedroom first, then the bathroom, then the kitchen again, as if her mother might somehow appear if she repeated the sequence carefully enough. "She is not here," she whispered, though they all knew it already. Her voice had changed. Not louder, thinner. Ethan glanced at the note in her hand. "Has she ever left you a note like that before?" Naomi nodded, eyes still scanning the apartment. "Sometimes if her shift changes. She tells me to stay with Mrs. Alvarez downstairs, but Mrs. Alvarez went to Jersey to see her sister this week." She looked toward the counter then, where a phone charger lay coiled beside a sugar jar. "Her charger is here," she said. She would not leave without it. Ethan felt that line settle coldly in his chest. Small details. The kind people miss until something is wrong. He crossed to the table and noticed another paper half tucked beneath Naomi's homework folder. It was a pay stub from a commercial cleaning company, the logo printed in blue across the top. Renee Carter. Hours, 72. Week ending. Yesterday. Ethan's eyes narrowed. 72 hours. Naomi was standing near the sink now, shoulders smaller than before, still clutching the note. "She always comes back," she said, not to anyone exactly, but into the room itself, as if the walls might confirm it. Ethan looked around the apartment again, at the carefully folded dish towel, the single winter coat hanging by the door, the child's drawing on the table, the tired neatness of everything, and something in him shifted from sympathy into resolve. This was no longer a favor, no longer a strange detour on a rainy night. "Naomi," he said, and when she turned, he made sure his voice was steady enough to hold hers. "We are going to find your mother." She searched his face for a second, testing whether adults still meant what they said after midnight. Then, from the hallway beyond the still open door, footsteps approached, slow and uneven, and someone stopped just outside apartment 3C. The footsteps paused just outside the apartment, followed by the faint rustle of plastic grocery bags and the dry little cough of someone who had climbed too many stairs too late at night. Naomi turned so fast the note trembled in her hands. For one bright second, hope flashed across her face, quick and vulnerable, the kind that made Ethan look away before it could break. But it was not her mother. An elderly woman stood in the doorway wearing a quilted house robe over a flowered nightgown, her silver hair wrapped in a scarf, her eyes tired but sharp behind large square glasses. She carried a carton of eggs in one hand and a loaf of bread tucked beneath her arm. "Naomi," she said softly, then looked past the girl and took in Ethan, the security man, the open apartment, the wet shine still clinging to their coats. "Oh baby, you found your way back." Naomi's shoulders dropped just a little. "Miss Evelyn, have you seen my mom?" The older woman's expression changed at once, concern rising like a curtain pulled too quickly. She stepped inside and set the groceries on the table with the care of someone who knew how easily ordinary things could become the only stable thing in a hard week. "No, sweetheart," she said. "I was hoping she had made it home already." Ethan watched Naomi's fingers tighten around the note. "You know Renee?" he asked. Miss Evelyn turned toward him, measuring him with one long glance that started at his polished shoes and finished somewhere near the fatigue in his eyes. I know she works too hard and sleeps too little, she said. And I know that child has better manners than most grown folks I have met. She softened then, looking back at Naomi. Your mama stopped by my door around 4:30. Said she got called to another building for an extra shift, but she looked worn out. Real worn out. I told her to sit down and drink some tea first. She said she did not have time. Naomi stepped closer. Did she say where? Miss Evelyn frowned, searching her memory. Downtown somewhere. Office towers. She said the contract company was short-handed again. Ethan's eyes dropped to the pay stub still lying half exposed on the table. The cleaning company logo looked annoyingly familiar now, the kind of subcontractor name he had seen on expense summaries and never once remembered after signing off. Did she leave a phone number for the supervisor? He asked. Miss Evelyn shook her head. Only said if she ran late. Naomi was supposed to wait with Mrs. Alvarez. But when that lady left for Jersey, I guess the plan changed. Naomi looked at the note again. She wrote warm because she knew I would wait outside if I had to. The words were quiet, almost matter of fact, but they settled over the room with a heaviness that made even the refrigerator hum sound lonely. Miss Evelyn reached out and touched Naomi's shoulder. You should have knocked on my door, baby. Naomi gave a small, embarrassed shrug. I thought maybe she was already here, and I just missed her. Ethan turned away for half a second and looked around the apartment again. The school paper with the gold star. The dish towel folded neatly by the sink. The extra pair of socks peeking from Naomi's backpack. A whole life held together with routines so delicate one missed bus, one extra shift, one dead phone battery could shake all of it loose. What company does Renee work for? He asked. Naomi pointed to the pay stub. That one. She says they send her wherever people do not want to stay late and clean up after themselves. Ethan picked it up fully this time and read the name printed at the top. Brightstar Facility Services. Below that, a partial client line. Whitmore Capital Annex, Midtown East. Something cold and metallic moved through him then, sharper than guilt and harder to ignore. One of his buildings. Or close enough to be his problem. Sir? Naomi asked, seeing something shift in his face. Ethan looked up. Your mother may have been working in one of my office buildings tonight. Naomi blinked, as if the sentence itself belonged to some stranger story that had wandered into hers by mistake. Your building? One of them, he said. Or a property managed through my company. Miss Evelyn let out a long breath through her nose. Not dramatic, just knowing. That is how it always goes, she murmured. Folks upstairs never know the names of the ones still mopping after midnight. Ethan did not defend himself. He could not. Not with the proof of it standing in front of him in a damp apartment with buzzing lights and a child trying very hard not to be afraid. Naomi asked the only thing that mattered to her. Can we go there? Ethan already had his phone out. Yes. He stepped toward the window for signal and called Margaret Hale first, his chief of staff and the one person in his orbit who never mistook urgency for inconvenience. She answered on the second ring, voice crisp despite the hour. Ethan gave her the company name, the location, Renee Carter's full name, and told her to get every active contact tied to the subcontractor, the building manager, and any emergency response log tonight. Margaret did not waste a second asking why. I will call you back in 3 minutes, she said. Ethan lowered the phone and turned. Naomi was standing exactly where he had left her, but now Miss Evelyn had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, tucking it in gently at the front. The gesture was so simple it nearly undid him. You should eat something before you go, Miss Evelyn said, already opening a cabinet. I have soup. Naomi shook her head. Not until I know where she is. Ethan looked at her for a moment, then at the nearly empty kitchen. You should still take something with you. Naomi hesitated, then nodded because she had been taught not to refuse kindness when it came in honest hands. Miss Evelyn filled a travel cup with warm chicken broth and wrapped it in a dish towel so Naomi would not burn her fingers. The apartment smelled suddenly of salt and pepper and something human and ordinary enough to hurt. Ethan's phone buzzed in his hand. Margaret. He answered at once. Her voice was lower now. Renee Carter was taken by ambulance from Whitmore Capital Annex at 8:14 tonight. Collapse from exhaustion, according to the initial incident report. She was transported to St. Luke's downtown. Ethan closed his eyes for the briefest second. Naomi was watching him so closely it felt like standing in direct light. Is she alive? She asked before he could speak. Ethan opened his eyes and met hers. Yes, he said. She is alive. Naomi did not smile. She just pressed the warm cup to her chest with both hands and let out one shaky breath, like her body had been braced against something terrible and was only now being told it could loosen by an inch. The ride to St. Luke's unfolded beneath a sky the color of wet slate, with the city thinning and thickening around them in pulses of red brake lights, glowing pharmacy signs, and traffic signals reflected across the hood like restless thoughts. Naomi sat deeper in the corner of the back seat now, Miss Evelyn's shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the warm cup of broth held carefully between both hands as if it contained more than heat. She had taken only 2 small sips, each one polite, each one measured, and then she held it close again, letting the steam rise against her chin. Ethan watched her in the dark glass reflection without making it obvious. Children usually filled silence by asking questions, by fidgeting, by letting fear leak out sideways. Naomi did none of that. She looked out at the city as if trying to memorize every turn, every storefront, every block between herself and the place where her mother lay under fluorescent lights. The driver took the FDR south, tires humming over slick pavement, while the East River flashed to their right in broken strips of black and silver. Ethan's phone remained in his hand. Margaret had already sent 3 texts: ambulance unit number, intake time, and a note that the hospital had her listed as stable but still under evaluation. Stable. The word should have eased something in him, but it did not. Stable was a word people used when they did not yet know the ending. Naomi's voice came softly, almost hidden beneath the heater fan. Will they let me see her? Ethan turned toward her. I do not know yet, he said honestly, but I will make sure someone tells us exactly what is happening. Naomi nodded and looked back out the window. My mom does not like hospitals, she said after a moment. She says they smell like bleach and waiting. Ethan almost asked how a child that young could say something that old, but he already knew the answer. She had been listening her whole life. She may still be asleep when we get there, he said instead. Naomi lowered her eyes to the cup in her hands. That is okay. I just want her to know I came. Those words stayed with him all the way to the hospital entrance. St. Luke's downtown rose out of the wet dark in pale stone and glass, its emergency canopy lit so brightly it made the rain look like falling wire. A security guard opened the door before the car fully stopped, one glance at Ethan enough to shift posture and tone. That was the world he lived in. Doors opening faster. Answers arriving cleaner. Tonight, for the first time in years, it felt less like power and more like borrowed access he had not earned. Naomi stepped out beside him, one hand still around the travel cup, the other gripping the strap of her backpack. The lobby smelled exactly as her mother had said it would, bleach and coffee and the stale fatigue of a building that never got to sleep. Nurses moved behind the front desk in navy scrubs, their sneakers whispering across polished floors. A television in the corner played a muted weather report no one was watching. Somewhere beyond a set of double doors, a monitor beeped in a steady patient rhythm. Ethan approached intake while his security man stayed a respectful distance back. Renee Carter, he said. She was brought in around 8:14. The woman at the desk typed quickly, then glanced up at Naomi, at Ethan, at the hour on the wall clock. Are you family? Ethan opened his mouth, but Naomi answered first. I am her daughter. The woman's expression softened immediately. Give me 1 second, sweetheart. She made a call, listened, then nodded. Your mother is awake now, but she is still being evaluated. One visitor for a few minutes. Naomi took 1/2 step forward. Can I go? The nurse looked at Ethan. She cannot go alone. Ethan did not hesitate. Then I will go with her. They were led through a corridor washed in pale light that made everything look both too clean and too tired. Naomi's small shoes made almost no sound against the floor. Ethan's own footsteps seemed offensively loud beside hers. They passed curtained bays, rolling carts, a woman sleeping upright in a chair with her purse in her lap, a vending machine glowing blue at the end of a hall. Hospital time had its own gravity. It pulled everything quiet. At room 12, a doctor in his early 40s stepped out, reading from a tablet. Mr. Whitmore. Ethan blinked. You know who I am? I recognized you from the foundation board photo in the lobby, the doctor said, then lowered his voice. She is dehydrated, severely overworked, and running on almost nothing. We are keeping her overnight for monitoring. She should recover, but she has been pushing far past what her body can safely handle. Ethan looked toward the partly open door. Did she say anything? The doctor glanced down at Naomi, and his face changed. She asked if someone had called for her daughter. Naomi pressed her lips together, and Ethan saw the exact moment relief and fear collided inside her. The doctor crouched just enough to meet her eye level. Your mom wants to see you. Naomi did not move at first. Her broth cup shook once in her hands, barely noticeable, but Ethan noticed. He took it gently from her and set it on a nearby chair. Go on, he said. Naomi nodded and stepped into the room. Ethan followed one pace behind, then stopped near the foot of the bed, suddenly aware that he had entered a sacred place without invitation. Renee Carter lay propped against white pillows, her skin warm brown under the washed-out hospital light, her face thinner than Naomi's but shaped in the same quiet lines. An oxygen cannula rested beneath her nose. One hand lay on top of the blanket, the fingers roughened by work. The second she saw Naomi, her whole face changed. Not dramatically, just deeply. Her eyes filled before any tears could fall. Baby. Naomi crossed the room in 3 quick steps and reached for her mother's hand with both of hers. Careful of the 4-line, careful of everything. I am here, she whispered. I am okay. Renee closed her eyes for 1 second, like someone hearing water after crossing too much dust. When she opened them again, she looked at Ethan over Naomi's bowed head, confusion touching first, then memory, then embarrassment, because some people apologized even from hospital beds. Sir, she said hoarsely, I am sorry if Naomi bothered you. The sentence landed so hard in Ethan that for a moment he could not answer. Naomi turned at once. I did not bother him, she said, with more firmness than Ethan had heard from her all night. Renee managed the ghost of a smile, but the shame still lingered around the edges of it, old and practiced. Ethan stepped closer, the fluorescent light flattening the world until only the truth in the room remained. No, he said quietly. She did not bother me at all. And for the first time that night, he understood just how much it cost both of them to expect otherwise. For a few seconds, no one in room 12 said anything more. The monitor beside Renee's bed kept its calm green rhythm. The 4-pump blinked softly, and the fluorescent light above them flattened every expensive distinction Ethan had ever worn into something ordinary and almost embarrassingly human. Naomi still held her mother's hand with both of hers, standing close enough that the edge of the hospital blanket brushed her coat. Renee looked from her daughter to Ethan and back again, trying to make sense of how the two of them had entered the same sentence. How did she get here? Renee asked at last, her voice rough with dryness and fatigue. Naomi answered before Ethan could. I asked him for a ride. Renee's eyes widened, then narrowed with the kind of protective worry that survives even when the body has no strength left. Naomi. It was not anger, just the ache of a mother imagining all the wrong endings at once. I know, Naomi said quickly. But I waited, Mama. I waited where you said. Then it got late, and my phone died, and the food court closed, and I went where the lights were. Her voice remained careful, but Ethan could hear the tremor under it now, the one she had been outrunning all night. I did not know what else to do. Renee closed her eyes for a moment. 2 tears escaped anyway, slipping quietly into her hairline. Baby, I am so sorry. Naomi shook her head at once. You do not have to be sorry. The sentence was so immediate, so practiced, that Ethan felt it before he fully understood it. Some children learn multiplication tables. Some learned how to protect their parents from guilt. Renee squeezed Naomi's fingers as best she could. I should have found a way to call. Your supervisor should have called, Ethan said, more sharply than he intended. Both of them looked up at him. He steadied his tone. You collapsed in one of my buildings. Your daughter was left alone for hours. That should never have happened. Renee's face changed then, not into recognition exactly, but into the guarded expression of someone who had spent too much of life dealing with people who could change her circumstances with one sentence and therefore had to be handled carefully. Sir, I do not want any trouble, she said. The company needed coverage. Somebody called out. I said yes because I always say yes. That is not your fault. Ethan looked at her, really looked, at the hollows beneath her eyes, the cracked skin at her knuckles, the weariness that seemed to live not just in her muscles, but in the very way she held silence. That may be true, he said quietly, but it is still my responsibility. Naomi glanced between them, listening the way children do when they know adults are speaking about more than the words on the surface. A nurse stepped in then, checked the monitor, adjusted the flow on the floor, and offered Naomi a small paper cup of apple juice from a tray. Naomi accepted it with a soft thank you and did not drink it right away. The nurse smiled faintly at her, then at Renee. 5 more minutes, okay? Then we need to let Mom rest. The room softened again after she left. Rain traced thin silver lines down the dark hospital window. Somewhere in the corridor a cart rattled past, then faded. Ethan noticed a plastic belongings bag hanging from a hook near the wall. Inside were Renee's work shoes, a folded gray uniform shirt, a transit card, and a cheap phone with a cracked corner. Her whole workday reduced to a clear bag and a barcode sticker. He had seen cost reports treated with more ceremony. "Mama," Naomi said softly. "Miss Evelyn gave me broth." That finally pulled the smallest smile from Renee. "Did she now?" Naomi nodded. "She wrapped it in the blue towel so my hands would not get too hot." Renee's eyes warmed. "That sounds like Miss Evelyn." Naomi lowered her gaze to the apple juice cup turning slowly between her fingers. "I still have not finished my spelling sheet," she said, in the same tone another child might have used to mention a scraped knee or a lost toy. The line was so unexpected Ethan almost missed what it really was. Not a complaint. A reach for normal. A small bridge back to the world before tonight became a story. Renee let out a breath that sounded close to a laugh and close to tears. "Then I guess tomorrow we do spelling in the hospital." Naomi gave one tiny nod as if that settled things. Ethan stood there watching them and felt something open in him that had stayed shut for years, not because he was cruel, but because numbness had once been easier than sorrow. He had told himself that distance was discipline, that efficiency was kindness in its most mature form. Fund the program. Sign the check. Let other people handle the tears. But now a little girl was talking about homework beside a hospital bed because life had never offered her the luxury of dramatic collapse, and a woman who cleaned his buildings past midnight was apologizing for almost disappearing inside one of them. His phone vibrated. "Margaret." He stepped into the hallway to answer, but he kept the room in sight through the small glass panel. Naomi had finally taken a sip of the apple juice. Renee was watching her with the fragile concentration of someone who needed that image to get through the night. "I have more," Margaret said immediately. Brightstar logged Renee for a double extension without approving transportation home. The floor manager filed the medical incident and left. No follow-up family contact. No welfare check. Ethan leaned one shoulder against the wall, the corridor cool and overlit around him. "Who oversees that contract?" "Your operations vice president for facilities," Margaret said. "I can have him on the phone in 2 minutes." Ethan looked through the glass again. Naomi had climbed carefully into the visitor chair now, still in her damp coat, her head tilted toward her mother, listening. So small, so steady. "No," he said. "Not tonight. Tonight you get me every contract tied to overnight cleaning, every subcontractor policy, every incident report from the last 12 months, and a room upstairs or nearby where Naomi can sleep if she has to stay." Margaret did not pause. "Done." Ethan ended the call slowly. When he stepped back into room 12, Naomi looked up at him with the quiet alertness she carried everywhere, as if she had long ago learned that every adult returning to a doorway might bring good news or bad. Ethan met her eyes and, for the first time that night, spoke to her not like a stranded child, not like an obligation, but like someone whose trust had to be deserved. "You are not going to spend the rest of this night wondering what happens next," he said. "I promise you that." The promise did not sound grand when Ethan said it. It was not wrapped in the polished confidence of television interviews or boardroom certainty. It came out lower than that, quieter, as if the room itself had stripped the extra layers off his voice and left behind only what could still be trusted. Naomi studied him for a moment from the visitor chair, her small fingers still circling the paper cup of apple juice, and then she gave one slight nod, the kind a child gives when she wants to believe an adult but has learned not to rush the feeling. Renee saw it too. Ethan could tell by the way her eyes lingered on him with something more complicated now than embarrassment or gratitude. Caution, yes. Exhaustion, certainly. But beneath that, a mother's reluctant calculation. If she let this man help, what would it cost later? A nurse returned with a clipboard and discharge estimates that meant nothing yet, adjusted Renee's blanket, and reminded them that visiting time was over for the night. Your mother needs sleep, she told Naomi gently. Real sleep. That will help more than anything. Naomi rose at once, obedient even in disappointment, and placed the untouched half of her apple juice on the tray table as neatly as if she were returning something borrowed. Can I come back in the morning? She asked. The nurse smiled. Yes, sweetheart. First thing if you want. Naomi turned to her mother. The room seemed to narrow around that one look. I will come back, she said. Renee lifted her hand off the blanket and Naomi took it quickly, pressing their palms together. I know, Renee whispered. And next time, you come with breakfast and that spelling sheet. Naomi's mouth moved into the faintest smile. I can bring both. Ethan stepped back to give them space, but he stayed close enough to see the way Naomi bent carefully and rested her forehead against her mother's hand for 1 second before letting go. There was no drama in it. That was what made it hurt. Love practiced under pressure always became efficient. Out in the hallway, the hospital had settled into that strange after-midnight rhythm where everything grew quieter without ever becoming still. A janitor pushed a mop bucket past the nurse's station. A vending machine buzzed softly near a row of molded plastic chairs. Somewhere far off, a child cried once and was soothed into silence. Naomi stood beside Ethan and looked smaller now that the immediate crisis had loosened its grip. Children could hold themselves together through fear in ways that startled adults, but the body always asked for its due eventually. Her eyelids had started to drag. Her shoulders no longer held the same alert tension. I can stay in the chair, she said before anyone asked. Ethan looked down at her. No, you cannot. Naomi opened her mouth, perhaps to argue, but a yawn arrived instead and broke whatever little wall she had left. She covered it quickly, embarrassed. Ethan pretended not to notice. He motioned toward the elevators. Come on. At the end of the corridor, Margaret Hale stepped out of a second elevator as if the building itself had delivered her on command. She wore a camel coat over dark slacks, her silver hair pulled back, a tablet tucked beneath one arm, and an overnight bag in her hand. Margaret never looked surprised by emergencies. She looked like emergencies had called ahead and been told to sit up straight. Naomi blinked at her. Margaret's expression softened instantly, not theatrically, just enough. You must be Naomi, she said. I brought you a toothbrush, clean pajamas, and socks that have not seen a puddle. Naomi looked at the bag, then at Ethan, checking the rules of this new world before stepping into it. Ethan answered with a slight nod. Margaret runs my life, he said. Margaret did not miss a beat, only the parts he would otherwise misplace. Naomi let out the smallest sound that might have been a laugh if she had not been so tired. It changed the air around them by half a degree. Margaret crouched enough to hand over the bag without towering. There is a family suite on the 6th floor for overnight guardians. It is not fancy, but it is warm and there is a bed. Naomi took the bag with both hands. Thank you, ma'am. Margaret is fine, she said. And there is hot oatmeal up there if you decide being brave has made you hungry. Naomi glanced down, then admitted in a tiny voice, maybe a little. That sounds about right, Margaret said. As they walked toward the elevator, Ethan fell a step behind with Margaret. She lowered her voice. I have the files already moving to your email. There are more incident reports than there should be. Exhaustion, overnight accidents, missed transport reimbursements. Most of it buried in subcontract language and quietly settled. Ethan's jaw tightened. How many? Too many for tonight, Margaret said. Enough for tomorrow. He nodded once. Tomorrow. The word usually meant markets, schedules, quarterly calls, rehearsed strategy. Tonight it meant something else. A child with damp braids carrying a bag of borrowed pajamas. A mother on the 3rd floor of St. Luke's with an 4 in her arm because labor had been squeezed until it stopped sounding human. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Inside, the mirrored walls briefly caught the 3 of them together. A billionaire in a dark suit gone slightly rain-creased. A woman who had built her career turning crisis into order, and a 9-year-old girl clutching an overnight bag like it might disappear if she loosened her grip. Naomi looked at the mirror, then looked away. I do not want to leave the hospital, she said. Ethan answered before the silence could thicken around her fear. You are not leaving your mother, he said. You are sleeping 1 floor away from her, so you can be strong in the morning. Naomi considered that. Children always knew when adults were dressing hard things in gentler language, but sometimes they accepted it anyway if the gentleness was honest. Will you still be here tomorrow? She asked. Ethan met her eyes in the mirror. Yes. The doors opened on the 6th floor to a smaller corridor lined with family rooms, quieter than the emergency wing, with warm lamplight instead of harsh fluorescence, and a coffee station no one had fully cleaned. One of the rooms stood open, a simple space with a fold-out couch, a narrow bed, a private bathroom, and a window showing the city as a scatter of distant lights above wet streets. Naomi stepped inside slowly, taking in the room with the guarded wonder of someone and used to comfort that came without a price. Tag. On the side table sat a bowl of oatmeal, a banana, and a carton of milk Margaret had apparently arranged in the 10 minutes since arriving. Naomi looked at it all, and then at Ethan again, and this time there was no caution in her face for one brief, unguarded second. Only pure tired relief. It hit him harder than any accusation could have. She set her backpack down by the chair, unzipped it, and carefully removed a crumpled worksheet with spelling words across the top. Then she placed it on the table beside the oatmeal as if, even here, even now, she needed one familiar thing to prove the world had not tipped all the way over. Ethan watched her do it, and understood that the deepest kind of fear was not loud. It was orderly. It folded its coat. It saved its homework. It thanked strangers for socks. And standing there in the quiet warmth of that little hospital room, he realized with a clarity that left no room for retreat that what Naomi had asked from him on a rainy sidewalk was never just a ride. Naomi ate the oatmeal in small patient bites, not because she was trying to be delicate, but because she had learned to make warm things last. The paper bowl sat in both hands, steam lifting lightly against her face, while the banana and milk remained untouched beside her spelling sheet like items in a life too orderly to trust all at once. Ethan stood near the window for a while, his jacket still on, his phone dark in one hand, watching the reflection of the room hover against the glass. Outside, the rain had weakened to a thin silver mist over the city, the streets below shining under traffic lights and ambulance strobes that flashed now and then across the hospital facade. Inside, the room had gone quiet in a different way than the emergency floor. Softer, human, the kind of quiet that invited memory whether you wanted it or not. Naomi set the empty bowl down and carefully folded the napkin Margaret had left beside it. Then she slid into the chair at the small table and pulled the spelling sheet closer. Ethan looked over. You are doing homework? Naomi nodded without looking up. I have a test Friday. It is after midnight, he said. I know. She traced one of the printed words with her finger. But I missed tonight, and I do better when I see the words before I sleep. Ethan did not answer right away. There was something almost unbearable about the steadiness of that explanation. Not because it was dramatic, because it was ordinary. A child in borrowed pajamas, one floor above her mother's hospital room, still trying to stay on schedule. He crossed the room and looked down at the worksheet. The words were simple ones for a 4th grader. Enough. Because. Thought. Light. Brought. Naomi had already written 3 of them in careful pencil, her letters rounded and even. You have good handwriting, he said. Naomi glanced up, uncertain whether that counted as conversation or inspection. My mom says neat writing helps people take you seriously. The sentence landed between them with more weight than she seemed to realize. Ethan pulled out the other chair and sat down across from her. His suit cost more than many people's monthly rent. Yet in that moment it felt strangely irrelevant, like an overdressed mistake in a room where the most important object was a school worksheet beginning to curl at the corners. Did your mother teach you that? He asked. Naomi nodded. She says if people already want to decide things about you, do not give them more reasons. Ethan looked at the pencil in her hand, at the quiet concentration in her small face, at the way exhaustion had started to soften her posture even as she fought it. He thought of the files waiting in his email. Incident reports, missed transport reimbursements, overnight labor buried in subcontract language neat enough to pass through approvals without touching conscience. Naomi, he said, and she stopped writing. Has your mother always worked nights? Not always, she said. More since the rent went up. She erased a letter carefully and wrote it again. She used to clean a dentist office in Queens during the day, but then they changed companies. And your father? Naomi's pencil went still. Not dramatically, just long enough for silence to answer first. I do not know him, she said. My mom says some people leave before they learn how much they are missing. Ethan leaned back a fraction. It was not bitterness in her voice. Just something memorized, filed, and carried. Do you believe that? Naomi thought for a moment, which made the room feel even quieter. I think my mom wanted me to know it was not because of me. Ethan looked down at the table. Children were often spoken about as if they did not understand adult pain, when in truth they absorbed it with terrible efficiency. They only lacked the power to put it down. Naomi finished the word light, whispered it once under her breath, then moved to the next line. Ethan found himself reading along in silence. The clock on the wall clicked forward. Somewhere beyond the room, an elevator opened and closed. Margaret appeared once at the half-open door, saw them both at the table, and left without interrupting. After a while, Naomi set the pencil down and rubbed one eye with the back of her hand. Do you have children? She asked. The question arrived so gently it might have passed for curiosity, but Ethan felt it hit like a door opening to a room he had kept locked. He stared at the spelling sheet for a second longer before answering. I had a son. Naomi waited. She did not fill the pause. She seemed to know, instinctively, that some truths moved slowly because they had weight. His name was Noah, Ethan said. Even saying it aloud still altered the air. He died when he was 7. Naomi's hand slipped off the pencil completely now. I am sorry. Ethan nodded once, but the room had already shifted around him. The hum of the hospital vent, the pale light on the wall, the tiny socks Margaret had laid out by the bed. All of it began to feel threaded to something older, a life measured once in smaller shoes and unfinished drawings, and the sound of a child calling from the back seat. He used to fall asleep anywhere, Ethan said before he could stop himself. In cars, at dinner, on the floor with crayons still in his hand. Naomi listened with complete stillness, her eyes wide not with excitement, but with care. Did he like drawing? She asked. Ethan almost smiled. He liked starting drawings, not always finishing them. Naomi opened her backpack then and pulled out a sheet of paper folded in fourths. She flattened it on the table between them. It was a crayon drawing of a house under a yellow sun, a little lopsided but bright. In front of the house stood Naomi and her mother holding hands. Beside them was the outline of a taller figure in gray, no face, no details, just a place where someone might one day belong. Ethan looked at it without speaking. Who is that? He asked after a moment. Naomi shrugged, suddenly shy. Nobody yet. She touched the gray shape with one finger. I drew it because houses look sad if there are only 2 people in front of them. Ethan stared at the figure, so long the room around it seemed to blur. Not because of what it meant, but because of what it revealed. Even in uncertainty, even after long waits and dark hallways and hospital elevators, she still drew space for goodness. Space for someone to arrive. My mom says home is not always a place first, Naomi said quietly. Sometimes it is a person who makes the place feel safe. Ethan looked up at her then, and for a second there was no distance left between the man he had trained himself to be and the one grief had interrupted years ago. Naomi's eyelids drooped heavily after that, the last of her wakefulness finally giving way. She tried to pull the worksheet back toward her, but the pencil rolled from her fingers and tapped softly against the table. Ethan stood, gathered the paper and crayons carefully, and placed them beside the bed. That is enough spelling for tonight, he said. Naomi did not argue. She climbed into the narrow bed in borrowed pajamas, her braids fanned against the pillow, the blue hospital blanket pulled up to her chin. Ethan switched off the brighter lamp and left only the one near the window. Warm gold spread over the room. Naomi looked smaller there, but less alone. Mr. Whitmore? She murmured, already halfway to sleep. Yes. When my mom wakes up tomorrow, can you tell her I did not get scared? Ethan looked at the child who had stood in the rain, ridden through the city in silence, searched a dark apartment, and still saved room for homework. His throat tightened unexpectedly. You tell her yourself, he said. Naomi nodded once against the pillow. Okay. Within minutes her breathing changed, evening out into the deep, fragile rhythm of real sleep. Ethan remained in the chair by the window long after, the drawing still resting on the table beside him, the gray figure, standing faceless in crayon between mother and daughter, waiting for someone worthy enough to be given shape. At 3:17 in the morning, the city outside the hospital window had finally gone soft around the edges, its hard lines blurred by mist and distance. But Ethan Whitmore was still awake in the chair beside Naomi's bed, staring not at the skyline, not at the messages piling up on his phone, but at a child's crayon drawing lying flat beneath the lamp. The gray figure between mother and daughter had no face, no hands, no details that might bind it to one person, and yet Ethan had not been able to stop looking at it for nearly 20 minutes. It was not the drawing itself that unsettled him. It was the space it revealed, the quiet, stubborn hope of a little girl who still left room in her picture for someone kind to appear. Naomi slept on her side, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, the blue hospital blanket rising and falling in shallow, even waves. Without the tension in her shoulders, without the careful politeness holding her upright, she looked younger than 9. Younger than the streets and the waiting and the note taped to the apartment door had allowed her to be. Ethan stood at last and crossed to the window, careful not to wake her. The reflection looking back at him was dim now, half glass and half ghost, his tie loosened, his shirt creased, his face carrying that hollowed-out look men often reached after a night that rearranged something fundamental. His phone lit in his hand again. "Margaret," he answered in a whisper. "I sent the full file," she said. "You are not going to like it." Ethan looked down at the city. "I already do not. Brightstar has had 7 overnight medical incidents across your managed properties in 11 months. 3 involved workers being kept past scheduled hours without transport assistance. 2 were flagged by supervisors and closed without executive review because the subcontract language insulated the parent properties from direct liability. Renee Carter is not an exception. She is a pattern." Ethan closed his eyes for 1 second. Not from surprise. From recognition. The sort that came too late to qualify as innocence. "Who drafted the subcontract terms?" he asked. "Legal under facilities operations. Signed off 2 years ago during cost restructuring." Margaret paused. "There is more." Renee had requested adjusted scheduling twice in the last 4 months. Both requests were denied. Ethan opened his eyes and turned toward the sleeping child in the bed. "Because no staffing flexibility. That is the phrase in the notes." Margaret's voice stayed level, but he knew her well enough to hear the controlled anger underneath it. In plain English, they worked her because she would say yes. Ethan looked back to the drawing on the table, the gray figure waiting to become real. "Set a meeting for 8 sharp," he said. "Operations, legal, facilities, vendor compliance, and every person who thought the word subcontract meant invisible." "Already done," Margaret replied. "There is one more thing. Hospital billing flagged that Renee's insurance is minimal. Observation overnight is covered only in part." Ethan gave a quiet, humorless breath. Of course it was. The same system that had taken her strength by the hour would now send paper to collect what was left. "Take care of it," he said, quietly. "Done." He ended the call and stood still for a moment in the golden low light. Then, because sleep was impossible and stillness suddenly felt too close to cowardice, he stepped into the hallway and took the stairs down instead of the elevator. The hospital at that hour had a strange grace to it. Nurses moved in soft-soled shoes with charts hugged close to their chests. A volunteer at the information desk had fallen asleep over a crossword puzzle. The coffee station on the 4th floor smelled burnt and overused. At room 12, he paused before entering, not out of ceremony exactly, but because he had spent much of his life walking into spaces like he belonged there, and tonight that certainty felt indecent. Renee was awake, not fully upright, but no longer lost in sedation and exhaustion. A reading light glowed above her bed, and in its pale circle she looked both stronger and more fragile than before, like someone held together now less by will than by the temporary permission of medicine. She turned when he entered. For a moment surprise passed across her face, then caution returned and settled there. "Naomi?" she asked at once. "Sleeping upstairs," Ethan said. "1 floor above you. Warm. Safe." Renee let out a breath that seemed to have been trapped in her ribs for hours. "Thank you." Ethan moved a little closer. There was a cup of water on the tray table, untouched crackers, and her cracked phone charging now from an outlet near the bed. Small mercies. Necessary ones. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Renee gave the sort of smile people offer when honesty feels impolite. "Like my body filed a complaint." Ethan almost smiled despite himself. She saw it and looked away. "I meant what I said before," he told her. "About responsibility." Renee was quiet for a few seconds. The monitor continued its steady rhythm. Rain touched the window again, softer now, more like memory than weather. Mr. Whitmore, she said at last, I know men like you are used to fixing things fast. But I need to say this plain. I do not want charity because I got sick at work. Ethan stood very still. And what do you want? She turned her face toward him fully then, and in that hospital light there was nothing dramatic about her, nothing styled for sympathy, just a tired black woman with dry hands and honest eyes asking to be seen correctly for once. I want my daughter not to spend one more night waiting on a step, because people built a system that assumes women like me will keep saying yes until we fall down. The words entered him cleanly, without ornament, and struck deeper because of it. Ethan nodded once. That is fair. Renee studied him, perhaps expecting defense, perhaps apology, perhaps the smooth language of well-meaning distance. He gave her none of those. You should know, he said, that your building is one of mine. Her gaze sharpened. I guessed. And you should know, he continued, that I did not know your name yesterday. Renee looked down at the blanket over her legs. That is usually how it works. It was not bitter. That made it worse. Ethan glanced toward the cracked phone charging by the bed. Naomi told me you said neat writing helps people take you seriously. Renee's expression shifted, surprised by the detail. It is true. She has beautiful handwriting. That did it. Something in her face softened then, not because the world had suddenly become kind, but because someone important had noticed something small about her child and treated it as important too. Mothers recognize that kind of seeing immediately. She practices, Renee said, and there it was, pride arriving quietly in a room that had held too much fatigue. She wants to be a teacher one week and an architect the next. Depends on what library book she last checked out. Ethan looked toward the window. She still made time for spelling tonight. Renee closed her eyes briefly, smiling through the ache. Of course she did. Silence settled again, but this time it was warmer. Not empty, just honest. Finally, Renee said, Did she tell you about the drawing? Ethan turned back. The one with the gray figure? Renee's eyes flickered with surprise. She has been drawing that for months. Who is it supposed to be? Renee let out a slow breath and stared at the ceiling as though the answer might be written there in fluorescent light. She says it is the person who shows up. Ethan did not move. The room seemed to narrow around that sentence until even the monitors sounded far away. Renee looked at him then, not pleading, not asking, just tired enough to tell the truth without dressing it up. She does not expect miracles, she said. She just notices who stays. Ethan stood in the pale circle of hospital light with 100 unread messages in his pocket and an 8 o'clock meeting already arranged to tear through contracts people like him had hidden behind for years. And for the first time since the rain-soaked sidewalk outside the hotel, he understood that the real test of the night had never been whether he would help. It was whether he would still be there when helping stopped being convenient. By 7:45, the rain had stopped, but the city still looked rinsed clean in that cold gray way New York sometimes wore the morning after a hard night, every sidewalk shining faintly, every window holding a little leftover weather. Ethan arrived at Whitmore Capital Annex without a driver for the first time in years. He had left the hospital less than 30 minutes earlier after checking once more on Naomi, who was still asleep upstairs with one hand curled around the edge of the blanket, and after stopping at room 12 where Renee had finally drifted into real rest. The building lobby greeted him the way it always did, with polished stone floors, brushed steel, the scent of expensive coffee drifting from the cafe near the elevators, and a receptionist whose spine straightened the second she saw him. Nothing in the building's appearance suggested that a woman had been worked past the point of collapse here less than 12 hours earlier. That, Ethan realized as he crossed the marble, was part of the problem. Systems that harmed people rarely looked cruel from the outside. They looked efficient. He took the elevator to the 23rd floor, where the facility's conference room already held half a dozen people in dark suits, tablets open, coffee cups steaming, faces composed in the careful neutral expressions executives practiced when they had not yet decided whether the morning would require apology, denial, or strategy. Margaret stood at the far end of the table with a stack of printed files and did not bother sitting. The operations vice president, Howard Greer, rose halfway in greeting. Ethan, we were just reviewing the overnight report, and I think some context is important before anyone overreacts. Ethan took his seat, but did not remove his coat. Good, he said. Then let us begin with context. The room shifted almost imperceptibly. Howard cleared his throat and tapped a folder. Renee Carter is employed by a third-party subcontractor. While the incident is regrettable, there is limited direct liability on our side under the service agreement. The response protocol was followed. Emergency services were called. The vendor is responsible for staffing and post-incident family notification. Ethan looked at him for a long second. Say that again, he said. Howard blinked. The vendor is responsible for, no. Ethan interrupted quietly. The first part. The part where you used the word regrettable like it was enough. Nobody moved. Margaret slid one file across the table. Ethan opened it. There they were. 7 incidents. Dates. Buildings. Workers. Notes reduced to professional language that made exhaustion sound administrative and fear sound procedural. He turned one page, then another. Overnight extension. No transport provided. Request denied. Worker advised to continue. How long have you known this pattern existed? He asked. Howard straightened. There is no pattern, Ethan. There are isolated contractor issues in a labor market that has been strained for years. Margaret spoke before Ethan could. 7 medical events in 11 months across managed properties is not isolated. 2 prior vendor warnings were closed without executive review. Howard looked at her sharply. With respect, Margaret, facilities decisions require cost balancing, and cost balancing. Ethan repeated, very softly. He closed the file. The sound echoed harder than it should have in the quiet room. A 9-year-old girl waited outside in the dark last night because her mother was treated like a replaceable hour on a spreadsheet. No one answered. He let the silence sit. Let it do what silence sometimes did better than anger. Did anyone here call the hospital? He asked. No one spoke. Did anyone ask whether she had a child at home? Still nothing. The head of legal, a woman named Sharon Bell, folded her hands more tightly on the table. From a compliance standpoint, the subcontract insulation was drafted to protect the parent entity from operational exposure. It is standard. Ethan turned to her. Then standard is broken. She held his gaze, perhaps expecting rhetoric, perhaps waiting for the sharper version of him everyone in the room knew. What she got instead was quieter and somehow harder. I do not care what language we use to protect ourselves from seeing this. Fix it. Howard shifted in his chair. We can revisit terms next quarter, but immediate changes across all managed properties would be disruptive and expensive. Ethan looked at him with an expression so still it made the word expensive sound childish. Good, he said. Be disrupted. Margaret began handing out a 1-page directive. Effective immediately, she said. All overnight contracted workers across Whitmore managed properties will receive direct emergency contact logging, transportation guarantees after unscheduled extensions, mandatory supervisor welfare checks after medical incidents, and review access to parent management regardless of vendor status. Additionally, we are suspending Brightstar pending independent audit. Howard stared down at the page. You cannot implement all of this overnight. Ethan stood. Then watch me. The room went quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. Not bureaucratic. Personal. The kind that comes when people realize the old language is no longer enough to hide behind. Ethan placed both hands lightly on the table and looked at each of them in turn. You all know how to move fast when money is at risk. I have seen it. I have rewarded it. So do not insult me by pretending human beings require more processing time. He straightened and buttoned his coat with one deliberate motion. By noon, I want direct outreach to every overnight worker on active contracts. By close of business, I want revised protections in writing. By tomorrow morning, I want a relief fund set up for emergency family support, and I want it named for workers, not donors. Howard opened his mouth again, perhaps to argue, perhaps to survive, but Ethan was already walking toward the door. He stopped only once, hand on the handle, and without turning back he said, and one more thing. Learn Renee Carter's name, because she is no longer invisible in this building. He left them with the files, the coffee cooling untouched, the polished glass walls reflecting their own discomfort back at them. Down in the elevator, the city rose around him in mirrored towers and pale winter light, but Ethan no longer saw only property lines and revenue streams. He saw stairwells a cleaning woman climbed while exhausted, hallways where no one asked who was going home to a child. Lobbies designed to impress people who had never once noticed the hands that kept them shining. When the doors opened on the ground floor, Margaret was already waiting with a paper bag from the hospital cafe. Blueberry muffin, Plain oatmeal and orange juice, she said. For Naomi. Ethan took the bag. And for Renee? Margaret held up a second one. Tea. Toast. And the form's billing tried to push through. They will disappear. For the first time that morning, something close to warmth moved through him. Not satisfaction. Something quieter. More earned. Come on, he said. We are going back. And as he stepped out into the bright, cold morning carrying breakfast in his hands instead of a briefing book, Ethan understood that the most important meeting of his day was not the one he had just ended. It was the one waiting for him in a hospital room where a little girl would soon wake up and decide, with all the precision children bring to matters of trust, whether he had truly meant it when he stayed. Naomi woke to the smell of toasted bread and something sweet, warm enough to make the little family room feel less like a hospital and more like a borrowed morning. For a few seconds she stayed still beneath the blanket, blinking at the pale daylight gathered in the window, as if she needed to sort sleep from memory. Then she saw her backpack beside the chair, her spelling sheet stacked neatly on top, and Ethan sitting near the small table with a paper coffee cup in one hand and a folded newspaper he had not actually read. He looked up the moment her eyes opened. Good morning, he said. Naomi pushed herself upright too quickly, then looked around at once. My mom. Ethan set the coffee down. Still here. Still resting. And asking for you. The fear that flashed across Naomi's face dissolved so fast, it was almost painful to watch. She pressed both palms against the mattress as though she needed to steady herself inside the relief. Margaret stepped in a moment later carrying the second breakfast bag and a small comb she must have found somewhere before sunrise. Before we go downstairs, she said, I thought you might want to face the day looking like you mean business. Naomi touched one of her braids and gave a shy nod. 10 minutes later she was dressed again in her own clothes, though Margaret had somehow dried and warmed them so the fabric no longer felt rain-heavy or tired, and she ate half a blueberry muffin while Ethan stood at the sink stirring instant oatmeal into a paper cup with the seriousness of a man attempting unfamiliar work. Naomi watched him with quiet concentration. You are doing it wrong, she said at last. Ethan looked down at the oatmeal, then back at her. That seems possible. Naomi slid off the bed and came closer. You have to stir the bottom too, or the lump stays there. She pointed without touching. Ethan followed her instruction. Like this. Naomi nodded once. That is better. Margaret, standing by the door, hid a smile behind her hand. The moment was so small it might have gone unnoticed in any other room, but here it landed softly and stayed. When they reached room 12, Renee was more awake than before, propped higher against the pillows, her face less gray with exhaustion though still shadowed by the kind of weariness that did not leave overnight. The second Naomi came through the door with the muffin wrapper still in one hand, the room changed. It did not brighten in any visible way. The hospital light remained hospital light. The monitor kept its patient rhythm, but something warmer entered it all the same. Mama. Naomi crossed to the bedside, and Renee opened her arm as much as the wires allowed. Naomi leaned in carefully, pressing herself against the blanket and her mother's side with the caution of a child who had already learned how to love around medical equipment. I brought breakfast, Naomi announced, and I finished most of my spelling. Renee let out a weak laugh that sounded better than anything Ethan had heard all morning. Most of it. Naomi lowered her voice as if confessing a crime. I fell asleep on the word because. Renee smiled fully then, and even the nurse adjusting her 4-line paused to smile too. Ethan placed the tray with tea and toast near the bed, then stepped back, but Renee looked up at him before he could retreat into politeness. Did you sleep at all? She asked. Ethan considered lying. Not much. You should, she said. People who try to fix the world tired usually make expensive mistakes. Naomi looked between them. He already fixed some things, she said. Ethan met Renee's eyes. He had intended to wait, to explain later, to avoid making promises in the fragile air of a recovery room. But Naomi's trust sat in the room like a clear glass object that could not survive vagueness. I met with my team this morning, he said. Brightstar has been suspended from my properties pending review. New protections are going into effect for overnight workers immediately. Transportation after unscheduled extensions. Family contacts logged. Welfare checks. Direct review of incidents. Renee stared at him, the toast untouched in her hand. That was this morning? Yes. Because of me? Ethan shook his head slightly. Because of what happened to you. And because you were not the first. The truth of that moved visibly across her face. Not as flattery, not even relief exactly, but as the tired recognition of a woman who had suspected for years that people like her only mattered when their suffering became impossible to hide. And the hospital bill? She asked quietly. Margaret answered from near the door. Handled. Renee looked from Margaret to Ethan and back again. I cannot repay this. Ethan stepped closer, but kept his voice level. I am not asking you to. Naomi, who had been listening to every word with the silent precision of a child building her understanding of the world in real time, reached into her backpack and pulled out the folded crayon drawing from the night before. She smoothed it on the blanket over her mother's legs. I want to show you something, she said. Renee looked down at the house, the yellow sun, the two figures holding hands, and then at the gray outline still standing beside them. You brought your drawing, she murmured. Naomi nodded. I think maybe I was wrong. Ethan felt something in the room slow. Even the nurse, now pretending to organize supplies at the counter, seemed to sense the shift. Naomi uncapped a brown crayon, then looked up at Ethan as if asking a question too large for words. He did not speak. He only stood still enough to let her choose freely. Naomi bent over the page and began to color in the gray figure. Not quickly, not like a child scribbling to fill space. Carefully, deliberately. Brown shoes first, then dark pants, then a coat. Then, after one small pause, she added a face. Simple eyes, a mouth, silver at the sides of the hair. Renee covered her lips with her fingertips, as if to hold something in. Ethan could not move at all. When Naomi finished, she held the drawing up so both adults could see it clearly. Home is still us, she said in her soft, serious voice. But now if somebody asks who showed up, I do not have to leave that part blank. Renee's eyes filled at once. Ethan looked at the colored-in figure on cheap white paper, drawn by a 9-year-old hand with rounded, careful letters still visible on the spelling sheet peeking from her backpack, and realized no board vote, no building he had ever bought, no award with his name engraved on polished metal had ever carried the weight of being seen like this. Naomi lowered the drawing and smiled at him then, not in awe, not in debt, but with the simple, unguarded warmth children sometimes offered when they had made a decision with their whole heart. And in that hospital room smelling faintly of tea, toast, and antiseptic, Ethan understood that redemption did not arrive with speeches. Sometimes it arrived with crayons. By late afternoon, the rain-washed light had turned softer, less silver now, more honey-colored where it stretched across the hospital floor and climbed the wall beside Renee's bed. The room no longer felt like a place of crisis. It felt like the strange in-between space where life, after threatening to come apart, began the quiet work of stitching itself back together. Naomi sat, cross-legged in the visitor chair with her spelling sheet on her lap and the crayon drawing propped carefully against the water pitcher where everyone could see it. She had finished the word because at last, pressing each letter with the same concentration, she gave everything that mattered. Renee had eaten half her toast and all of her tea. Color had returned a little to her face. Not much, but enough for Hope to stop feeling reckless. Ethan stood near the window with his phone in one hand while Margaret reviewed a folder in the other, the late light catching the silver in both their hair. He had spent the last few hours on calls, and each one had left something behind in his expression, not fatigue exactly, but the look of a man discovering how much of his old life had depended on not looking too closely. Naomi glanced up from her worksheet. Are you still working? She asked. Ethan looked over at her. Yes. Naomi frowned just slightly. Do not fall down. Renee let out a small laugh that softened immediately into a cough. Ethan surprised himself by smiling. I will do my best. Margaret closed the folder and stepped closer to the bed. There are a few things you should know, she said to Renee, her voice practical but warm. The hospital has cleared you for discharge tomorrow morning if your labs stay steady. A car will take you home. Groceries are already being delivered to your apartment tonight. Utility balances were checked this afternoon. Your rent for the next 6 months has been covered through a worker emergency fund. Renee's brow tightened at once. No, Margaret did not flinch. Yes. I said I do not want charity. Ethan turned from the window then. He had expected this. Maybe even respected it before it arrived. It is not charity, he said. It is correction. Renee looked at him carefully. That sounds expensive. It should. The answer settled in the room without pride. Without performance. Just truth. Naomi looked between them again, reading the emotional weather more clearly than most adults ever learned to. Renee shifted against the pillows, one hand moving protectively toward the edge of the blanket where Naomi's drawing rested. And after 6 months? She asked. Ethan stepped closer, but not so close it felt like pressure. After 6 months, if you want it, there is a permanent position available through Whitmore Community Education. Renee blinked. Education. The literacy centers we fund in Queens and Brooklyn, Margaret said. Morning hours. Full benefits. Family scheduling. Administrative and facility support combined. Less physical strain. More pay. Renee stared at her as if the words had arrived in the wrong room. You are offering me a job. We are offering you a fair one, Ethan said. And Naomi's school tuition at her current public program stays untouched. But if she qualifies for the summer design camp she listed on a library interest form last month, that will be covered too. Naomi's head lifted so fast her braids shifted against her shoulders. How do you know about that? Margaret allowed herself the smallest smile. You have excellent librarians. Naomi looked down at her spelling sheet, and then at the drawing, and then back at Ethan, as if her small world kept opening doors she had not known were there. Renee's eyes had filled again, but this time the emotion in them was more complicated than gratitude. It was grief too. Grief for all the years she had spent surviving on terms no one should have had to accept. People should not have to collapse in order to be noticed, she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. I know. The room went still. Outside the window, an ambulance turned the corner far below, its lights flashing soundlessly at this distance. Naomi set her pencil down and slid off the chair. She walked to her mother's bedside and took her hand, then looked up at Ethan with the same steady directness she had shown on the sidewalk the night before. Are we going home tomorrow? She asked. Ethan answered carefully, because he knew by now that children heard the truth in tone before they trusted the words. Yes, he said. Tomorrow you go home. Naomi considered that, then asked the harder question. Will home still feel the same? Renee looked at her daughter, and for the first time since Ethan had met them, there was no apology in her face. Only love and a kind of exhausted wisdom sharpened by pain. Some parts will, she said. The good parts. Naomi nodded slowly. Then she turned to Ethan again. And will you still come if we need help? It was not a dramatic plea. Not a test spoken loudly enough to make anyone noble. It was smaller than that. More dangerous. The kind of question that asked not what a man could give, but whether he meant to remain real after the moment had passed. Ethan moved closer to the bed until he stood inside the same circle of warm late light as mother and daughter. Yes, he said, but I am going to try very hard to help build a life where you do not need to ask strangers for that again. Naomi looked at him for one long second, then accepted the answer with the solemn grace children sometimes bring to promises they decide are worth keeping. Margaret placed a slim envelope on the tray table beside Renee's tea. Inside was a key card, a printed schedule for discharge, the new employment packet, emergency contacts, and a handwritten note in Margaret's precise script. No more waiting in the cold. Renee read the note and pressed her lips together. She did not cry this time. She just placed one hand over the envelope and held it there as though warming herself over a fire she had not expected to find. The light kept lowering, turning the edges of the room gold. Naomi climbed carefully onto the bed beside her mother, shoes off, knees tucked under the blanket, and rested her head lightly against Renee's shoulder. Ethan stood back then, not leaving, just giving the moment room to breathe. On the table, the crayon drawing leaned against the water pitcher, its once gray figure now colored in, no longer faceless, no longer waiting to be imagined into kindness. And as the evening gathered around the quiet hospital room, Ethan understood that what had changed was not only their future. It was the shape of his own life after this, the part of him that would no longer be able to return to polished distance and call it enough. The next morning arrived without spectacle. No music swelled. No miracle announced itself from the sky. There was only pale sunlight resting softly on the window of room 12, the smell of clean sheets and weak hospital coffee, and the quiet rustle of ordinary things being gathered back into life. Naomi sat in the chair tying her sneakers with slow, careful fingers, her backpack already zipped and waiting by the door. Renee stood near the bed in borrowed hospital slippers and a fresh cardigan Margaret had somehow produced before sunrise, one hand pressed lightly to the mattress as if steadying herself in the middle of a world that had shifted while she was not looking. Ethan stood a few feet away holding the discharge folder, no longer in yesterday's rain-creased suit, but in a dark coat left open at the front, his tie gone, his expression softer than the man who had stepped out of a gala 24 hours earlier. The nurse came in with final papers, a reminder about hydration, a follow-up appointment, and the kind of practiced kindness hospitals gave people when sending them back into lives that would still require courage. Naomi listened to every word as if she were old enough to carry the instructions herself. When the nurse left, the room fell quiet again. Renee looked around once, at the blanket folded at the foot of the bed, at the untouched plastic pitcher, at the crayon drawing now tucked safely into Naomi's folder. I kept thinking I would wake up and find out this was all one long strange dream, she said. Ethan handed her the discharge packet. It is not a dream. Renee took it, her fingers brushing the edge of his hand by accident, and she did not pull away immediately. No, she said, glancing toward Naomi. It is not. The elevator ride down was slow, almost tender in its silence. Naomi stood between them holding her backpack straps, swaying slightly each time the car stopped and started. On the lobby level, the morning had already gathered momentum. Nurses changed shifts. Visitors crossed polished floors carrying flowers and worry in equal measure. Somewhere near the entrance, a volunteer restocked a basket of old magazines no one really read. But when the three of them stepped out together, something about the sight made people look twice, not because they understood the story, but because even strangers could sense when a night had changed the shape of three lives at once. Outside, the air was cold but bright, washed clean after the rain. A Blacktown car waited at the curb, not flashy, just warm and ready. Margaret stood beside it with the last of the paperwork and a grocery receipt tucked into one folder. Your refrigerator is full, she told Renee. There is soup, fruit, eggs, oatmeal, and enough bread to survive a blizzard or Naomi's spelling week, whichever comes first. Naomi smiled. Renee looked at Margaret with the tired gratitude of someone who had been carried by competence and mercy at the same time. I do not know how to thank all of you. Margaret closed the folder and placed it gently in her hands. By resting today, she said. That will do for a start. The drive home felt different in daylight. Streets that had seemed lonely and uncertain the night before now showed their details clearly. The laundromat with the flickering sign, the corner deli with oranges stacked in the window, the church steps where pigeons gathered in little gray negotiations of their own. Naomi pointed out places as they passed, no longer because she feared being lost, but because children liked to narrate the geography of what was theirs. That is where Mama gets my favorite cereal when it is on sale, she said at one light. And that library has the good books upstairs if you ask nice. Ethan listened to every word. When they reached the apartment building, Miss Evelyn was already at the door in her robe and scarf, one hand on the frame, waiting as if she had been posted there by love itself. The second Naomi jumped out of the car, the old woman opened both arms and gathered her close with a small sound that was almost a prayer. There you are, baby. Naomi hugged her back hard enough to wrinkle the shawl. Renee climbed out more slowly, and when Miss Evelyn saw her, her face folded with relief, so pure it made Ethan look away for a second out of respect. Girl, Miss Evelyn said softly, taking Renee's hands in both of hers. You scared me half to death. I know, Renee whispered. I am sorry. Do not you dare apologize for surviving. They all went upstairs together. Apartment 3C looked the same as it had the night before, and yet not the same at all. The crooked wreath still hung on the blue door. The cereal bowl still rested upside down on the drying towel. The light still flickered once before settling. But the air inside no longer carried that suspended fear, that waiting. It carried groceries on the counter, morning light on the table, the quiet return of breath. Naomi ran first to the window, then to the kitchen, then back to her backpack, as if she needed to touch each ordinary object to prove home had truly stayed put. Renee stood in the middle of the room and let herself look around slowly. Then she turned to Ethan. I have been trying since last night to figure out the right words, she said. There probably are not any, he answered. She nodded once. Maybe not. But there is this. Most people with power think helping means deciding from above what someone else needs. You did something rarer. Ethan waited. Renee's eyes moved briefly to Naomi, who had just placed the crayon drawing upright against the sugar jar so it faced the room. You listened long enough to find out what mattered first. The room went still. Naomi looked up then, catching the last line, and smiled in that small, certain way of hers, like she recognized truth when it entered a room softly. Ethan glanced at the drawing. The house, the son, mother and daughter, and now the once gray figure standing beside them, no longer blank, no longer waiting to be believed into existence. I did not do this alone, he said. No, Renee replied. But you stayed. Naomi crossed the room, took the drawing in both hands, and walked over to him. I made one more change, she said. Ethan bent slightly, so he could see. In the corner above the house, beside the son, Naomi had added 3 tiny printed words in careful, neat handwriting. He came back. Ethan stared at the page for a long moment. Then he looked at Naomi, at the child who had asked for nothing more than a ride home, and somehow led him back to the part of himself he had left buried under money, grief, and polished distance. Naomi held the drawing out to him. This one is yours, she said. Ethan accepted it with both hands, more gently than he had ever held a contract, an award, or a set of keys. Outside, somewhere down on the street, a truck rumbled past and a dog barked, and the city continued being itself, loud and unceremonious and indifferent to private transformations. But inside apartment 3C, the morning light rested on the table, on the groceries, on the little backpack by the chair, on the tired woman finally sitting down, and on the man standing in a modest kitchen holding a child's drawing like it was something sacred. He had been asked for a ride. That was all. Just a way home through the dark. But in the end, the little girl had done something no boardroom, no therapist, no amount of wealth had managed in years. She had reminded him that kindness was not weakness, and that showing up was not small. Sometimes it was the whole difference between a house and a home.